This is WFYI News Now. It's November 15th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, the Indiana Supreme Court asks lawmakers for money to help improve security. A committee tasked with making legislative recommendations on Medicaid submits a report with no recommendations. And future Lieutenant Governor Micah Beckwith threatens to stop Indiana University's student newspaper.
And for him to engage in that kind of rhetoric, to my mind, is fundamentally inconsistent with what it means to have a commitment to free speech.
Those stories coming up, but first, the next installment of our regular segment called The Checkup from Side Effects Public Media, where the health reporting team explores a single question sparked by a recent news story, or maybe by one of our listeners.
On December 4th, the U.S. Supreme Court will take up one of the most hot-button healthcare issues right now, medical care for transgender youth. The federal government is suing on behalf of trans youth and their families in Tennessee over the state's gender-affirming care ban in the U.S. v. Scrimeti case. The court's ruling could affect the rights of nearly 1.6 million transgender Americans of all ages, and that's not just in Tennessee. That is across the country. So what's at stake in this case for people's healthcare access in the Midwest and across America? That's the Checkup's question for today. I'm Lizzie McGreevy, Community Engagement Specialist with Side Effects Public Media. And with me today is Trade-Off's producer, Ryan Levy.
Hey there, Lizzie.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for joining us again here on The Checkup. Can you start off by defining gender-affirming care for us?
Yeah, so gender-affirming care really kind of encompasses several different kinds of medical care that help someone's physical appearance line up with their gender identities. Things like puberty-blocking medications, hormone therapy, estrogen and testosterone, and then in rare cases, gender-affirming surgeries.
Can you give us an update on what medical experts are saying about gender-affirming care for minors?
Yeah, so the evidence here is hotly debated, very contentious. What we can say is that, almost every major medical group in the U.S. supports gender-affirming care for minors. Studies have shown that hormone therapy in particular leads to reductions in depression, anxiety, and suicidality. On the other side, though, opponents of gender-affirming care say that those studies are poor quality, that the evidence overall remains unclear. There are just too many unknowns. And they also say that this care can cause physical and psychological harm. But the uncertainty there has been enough for policymakers in the UK, several European countries, and obviously many states here to restrict or ban this care.
So there's a lot of uncertainty about this, it sounds like. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court will take up this U.S. v. Scrimeti case. Can you give us a bit more insight into this case?
Yeah, so this stems from Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care, which they passed in 2023. A few trans young people and their families sued Tennessee along with advocates and the federal government and got a federal judge to actually stop this law from going into effect originally back in 2023. The state appealed. A higher court overturned that. The law went into effect. And now the Biden administration is taking this to the Supreme Court to try to get this law struck down.
And what are opponents of Tennessee's ban saying about this?
Yeah, so they say that this is a clear example of sex discrimination. And that's important because in the legal world, if a state passes a law that treats people differently based on their sex, there is a higher burden, a higher bar that the state has to clear to prove that there's a good reason to have that kind of discriminatory law. So Katie Iyer is a law professor at Rutgers, and she says that this is an example of sex discrimination because trans kids are banned from getting care that cisgender kids can get.
There really is no way for a doctor to decide who is going to get access to care without looking at the sex of the patient. So that's really just straightforward differential treatment of people for the same treatments based on what sex they are.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that not all legal experts agree with Katie on this. What else are you hearing?
Yeah, so the other side, Lizzie, says that this is not about sex. This is about things that the state does all the time, regulating what kids can do and regulating what medical care can happen in their states. And so Jim Blumstein, who is a law professor at Vanderbilt University, put it this way.
There are certain things kids can't do. They can't vote. They can't drive a car and can't get married. Parents cannot say to a child, you don't have to go to school. Then the government can make you go to school.
The Supreme Court will hear this case in December, and I'm sure they'll hear from a lot more people. What are the different outcomes and scenarios that we can expect?
They could rule for the federal government and strike down the law. That would likely lead to the end of these kind of blanket bans across the country. They could side with Tennessee and uphold the law. That would, in addition to keeping these gender-affirming care bans in place, that could also provide some more legal support to other laws targeting the transgender community. There's also some concern from legal scholars that a ruling for Tennessee could threaten federal anti-discrimination protections for transgender patients, as well as opening the door to states banning gender-affirming care for adults, which we've already seen be attempted in Florida and Missouri. And the third option here is a bit more of like a middle-of-the-road approach. And this would involve the Supreme Court saying that, yes, this law is an example of sex discrimination, so it requires that higher level of proof, but they would send the case back down to a lower court to actually decide whether this law meets that higher level, whether Tennessee can prove that they have a good enough reason to ban this care for transgender kids. You know, President-elect Trump and what his administration could do, they could change the federal government's position on this, which could open the door to the justices on the Supreme Court dismissing the case and avoiding making any kind of ruling. It's still too early to know exactly what will happen, but the election definitely throws another wrinkle into this case.
Thank you for this information, Ryan. And if you have questions about healthcare or want to know more about some wild viral TikTok health claim, let us know. Until next time, stay safe.
That was The Checkup by Side Effects Public Media. Side Effects is a regional health reporting collaboration of NPR member stations across the Midwest, based here at WFYI. The Indiana Supreme Court is asking state lawmakers for new money to help improve security in courtrooms throughout the state. As Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports, the request is in response to what the Chief Justice says is an unprecedented level of threats against judicial officers.
The state Supreme Court surveyed more than 200 judges statewide, and Chief Justice Loretta Rush says about 75% of them reported being threatened.
We're seeing a lot of volatility in our courtrooms, a lot of volatility. Things that I've been a judge since elected in 1998. I've never seen this many to myself and to the judges throughout the state.
Rush says more worryingly, there are some courthouses in the state without any security measures. She's proposing a $1.5 million a year grant fund to help counties invest in court security. She says ways the money could be used could include purchasing metal detectors, reinforced security glass, security cameras, and alarm systems. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
A committee tasked with making legislative recommendations on Medicaid once again submitted a report with no recommendations. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports that last year, the committee chair said they would use any information from hearings to inform recommendations this year.
This year's Medicaid Oversight Committee chair submitted an informational report that summarized the only meeting the committee held. The committee did not propose or vote on any recommendations ahead of the 2025 legislative session. Democrat Greg Porter is the House minority member on the committee. He says lawmakers need to have meaningful conversations about what the future of Medicaid in the state holds, but only having one meeting cut off that debate.
We're going to be extremely vocal in regards to the lack of transparency and the lack of communication with the minority party.
Porter says people deserve to know what's happening with their Medicaid coverage. He also says the financial situation as a result of last year's Medicaid forecasting error is not as bad as it seemed. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
And for our final story today, future Lieutenant Governor Micah Beckwith threatened Tuesday to stop Indiana University's student newspaper. Beckwith tweeted that the Indiana Daily Student is leftist propaganda. IU Emeritus Law Professor Daniel Conkle called Beckwith's rhetoric disturbing.
And for him to engage in that kind of rhetoric, to my mind, is fundamentally inconsistent with what it means to have a commitment to free speech.
Bekonkle says retaliation is unlikely because Governor-elect Mike Braun likely won't enable it. He also says discriminating speech based on political viewpoints violates the First Amendment. Indiana student co-editor-in-chief Marissa Metter says she is concerned about Beckwith's tweet. She also says some of Beckwith's claims are wrong. Metter says IDS is not directly funded by taxpayers and that Beckwith mischaracterized published quotes from Donald Trump's former allies as coming from student reporters.
I mean, these were like former secretaries of defense, former chiefs of staff, that sort of thing. Like, these weren't, I mean, it's certainly not anything we were saying. They weren't what students were saying.
IU spokesperson Mark Bodie said in a statement the IDS is editorially independent from IU. Beckwith did not immediately respond to a request for comment. That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on Monday.